The topic of today, in the guest book he wrote already, the world has changed, and today we will talk about how the world has changed, especially by the trade, let's say trade war by the United States against the world, a reset of economic trade relations all over the world, and actually our guest was one of the driving forces of this change in the first Trump administration. He was his deputy trade assistant and was basically responsible for the trade negotiations with Japan and Korea. And basically, in his book, he forecasted already what will happen during the second Trump administration. So, without further ado, I would like to open the floor to him. So he will explain to us a little bit how we got here, what the reasons for the US trade policies are, and how we should interpret them, and what comes next.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Martin. Wonderful to be here. As I was telling Martin earlier, the last time I was at the Foreign Correspondents Club, I was an intern in Japan. This was 1990. Trade tensions with the United States were at a fevered pitch, and maybe a few of you know this case. T. Boone Pickens was speaking at the Foreign Correspondents Club about being blocked. His investment in a Japanese company was being blocked by the company, and it was quite a scene at the time. So this is many years in the making for me to return. Thank you again, Martin, for the invitation, and to the Professional Activities Committee that you work with here. Yes, so just very briefly about me. Martin gave a short introduction. I am no longer with the United States government. I actually retired officially in January of 2023, so about 2.5 years ago. But I spent 22 years in the U.S. government. 16 of those years I spent at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative as a trade official, trade negotiator. For all 16 years, I worked on Japan, actually. And then in 2017, very early 2017, just before the Trump administration began, the first one, I became assistant U.S. trade representative for Japan, Korea, and APEC. So I was responsible for the APEC forum and U.S. policy trade in that forum, and then for Japan and Korea. So during that time, during the first Trump administration, as Martin mentioned, I was responsible as the day-to-day lead for the U.S.-Japan trade agreement negotiations that succeeded and came to fruition in 2019. I also led the renegotiation of the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement under the first Trump administration. So I had a very front row view on a lot of feelings and emotions going on in the first administration. I think it's safe to say when President Biden was elected in 2020, there was a sense that America would probably return to a more familiar trade policy after the first Trump administration had completed. It quickly became very apparent to me that was not going to happen, that there was going to be a continuation, if anything, of many of the concerns and goals and objectives that the first Trump administration had started and that would kind of carry through the Biden administration. So tariffs continued in the Biden administration. U.S. support for the WTO and the international trading system and the trading rules continued to weaken under the Biden administration. In fact, they really sought to kind of overturn the U.S. approach in many ways. They spoke about the need to write a new story on trade, basically. So it was very clear to me that something fundamental was going on and changes. I think the world, for many years, always saw this as a reaction to China, and particularly in Asia, that the U.S. was changing its whole approach because China was a threat, and that's absolutely correct, that China was a major issue. But I also quickly understood that this was much deeper than just China, that something really different was happening in the United States. I decided to retire from the U.S. government and to go write about it because I thought it was so historic and transformational that I wanted to explain it to the world. So this is a wonderful opportunity to do that. So the book, actually, the last touch I had on the book was July of last year. It was published in September. And the book really talks about this fundamental shift and why it's happening and where it's going. So the timeline of change in the United States that kind of put the U.S. on this new road, this new path on trade, really began around the time of TPP finishing, the conclusion of negotiations, and then failing to get through the U.S. Congress. This was a sign that something was really going on. These changes in U.S. politics that led to that moment really started back in the 1990s into the early 2000s, but they didn't really rise up and become such a major force in the trade politics and trade policy until after the 2008 financial crisis. 2008 financial crisis, you saw the rise of the Tea Party on the right and kind of the creation of the new right of the United States on the Republican Party, and then a continued shift on the left toward moving more and more toward the progressive politics of the Democratic Party. So you begin to see this progressive left and this new right dichotomy pull away from the middle. And this middle was what supported the U.S. approach on trade in a bipartisan way for about 75 years. But as these forces were pulling at the sides and pulling away, the middle was on soft ground. In fact, it became on quicksand, and it couldn't support that consensus any longer. And the train was being driven by these two, what you can call extreme or far right and far left portions of the traditional Democratic and Republican Party that were fundamentally changing at those times as well. So what you also got during the mid-2010s was a concurrent rise in the extraordinary level of political polarization in the United States. Polls show that Americans were very split on the politics and on issues, increasingly more and more aggressive way, and each side tried to divide the country into two camps: the pure on the one side, whichever camp that they're in, or the pure people that they're fighting for, and then the corrupt people. It could be elites, it could be the opposition, it could be those on the other extreme who they're fighting against, basically. And this was really going on during this period of time. And this is really where the election of Donald Trump, the first time in 2016, came out of and surprised the world in many ways. But it was there, and it was coming up, and it was all coming around the same time, basically. So this consensus in the middle that supported the trade consensus began to collapse. The people in the middle are still around. There are just very few of them left trying to make this case. And it's being driven by the far right and the far left, the progressive left and the new right is a better way of describing them. And what you get also with this division is the rise of zero-sum politics. And I really want to emphasize this because I think this is the most important diagnosis of the issue to take away. What is zero-sum? Zero-sum is the idea that when others have gained something, you have lost something, basically, in some way, shape, or form. So you see this across the political spectrum in the United States. It's, win or else, right? And deny them any victory, and the only victory is your own victory and not giving the other side any piece of a victory, basically. So this zero-sum is the dynamic that really began to drive trade politics and trade policy that's being, driven by these two extremes. Essentially, the book looks at many different cases, some of that I was personally involved in, some that I was personally not involved in, but WTO negotiations, the first China tariff war, steel tariffs, negotiations with Japan and Korea, the Biden administration attempt to have a whole new vision for a trade agreement, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, developing country preferences, and the rest. And you see this pattern just repeats itself again and again and again. And what is that pattern? Well, trade has two dimensions, right? Part of the privilege of working as a trade official is we are right at the crossroads of domestic economic policy and foreign policy. This is exactly where those two things meet. So we're always having to look in both directions as we do trade work and follow political guidance that we receive from our different administrations. But in this new environment, in a zero-sum environment, there are two dimensions. There's the foreign dimension of trade, which, trade with Japan, trade with the EU, trade with Canada. And then there's the domestic dimension. There's the view of trade there. So in the foreign dimension, if you think about zero sum becomes the United States versus everybody else, right? Zero sum as trade is seen as a greater source of harm than it is of opportunity. So even if your country is growing through trade, as long as others are growing and benefiting from trade, and particularly if they're seen as benefiting more from trade than the United States, that is seen as harm. That is a zero-sum world, and this is where Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump sound the same on trade. It's a disaster, it's harmed America, and we need to stop it, basically. So you get this alignment, actually, between the new right and the progressive left on that point. And this is where the United States has become, where you see the consistency between the Trump administration and the Biden administration in erecting new walls and stepping away from the rules and kind of doing it as the United States wants to do it in order to benefit itself, benefit the nation. And to stem the harm from foreign competition. On the domestic side of trade, however, this is mostly shows up in terms of enormous conflict between the progressive left and the new right. What do I mean by this? For decades, the United States pushed its own rules, its own conditions, its own laws, regulations, approaches, values into the trading system, into the rules. This is what TPP was about, right? It was about a U.S. vision for a new order of rules for the road for trade. And these were American rules, for the most part, and American conditions and American approaches. But the reality is, as with TPP, as with others, these two sides are fighting over those rules in the United States. They're fighting over the status quo in the United States. So it's the environment, it's labor rights, it's views about digital trade, it's views about corporate influence, it's views about due process, it's views about transparency. All of these are all battlegrounds in the United States for domestic policy. So what happens is trade becomes a proxy battle for those rules, and neither side wants the status quo to continue in trade agreements and in those rules, basically. So this is why the rules, basically what happened is the U.S. cannot agree with its own rules any longer. And so how can it agree to trade agreements when those are the rules that it's trying to get other countries to agree to? So you get this conflict between the two sides. Whereas when it comes to external trade, the Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, you get alignment, you get similarity in view, us versus them, harm versus opportunity. So this is where you get this dichotomy that goes on, where they agree, basically, and then where they cannot agree. So you get an America that just continues to erect walls, but not be able to agree on a vision for the future. They just keep fighting with each other because they're fighting about the status quo in the United States, basically. So that is the whole point of this book, and to explain the new pattern. So what are the implications? The implications are, well, that this is a new direction for the United States. This is not a situation where the U.S. is just going to snap back to 2015, 2014. This is a new path that the U.S. is on. The only question is how fast and how hard and how fast it's going to go down this path. Had former Vice President Harris won the election, I absolutely think the U.S. would have continued down this path. It just would have been a softer version of this path. When you have the re-election of Donald Trump, it's 18 Mack trucks headed down the highway. That's what this feels like, basically. This is the same direction, though. It's all in the same direction. So this is why I say the world has changed. That's what I mean. It is headed in a very different way than what we've seen before. So for me, in terms of what's happening today, where are we today? That's the diagnosis, basically. Where are we today? I see a situation where having worked in the first Trump administration, so much of what you see today in terms of the policies, the announcements, the tariff threats, all of this and that, as very much as unfinished business from the first administration. In the first administration, a lot of these things were already in the box, and they were being discussed in the first administration. Just some of them came out of the box, basically, and were revealed to the world. But when the second Trump administration began, or even before it began, I knew what was inside this box, basically. And so there is virtually nothing I have seen that has surprised me, because I am very familiar with the thinking and the approach and the goals and objectives. It's just a much more extreme, full-on version of what's in that box that the world is seeing. And it is nothing less than America's attempt to reset the terms of trade with the world, period. That is it. There is a sense that it's harming America and that there has to be a complete shift and reset of trade. Be it on the Biden administration side, be it on the Trump administration side, this is the pathway, basically. The question is just how much and how fast, essentially. So just to make a couple of predictions, this is what I've been predicting for many months, which I think now is clear to everybody. Number one, uncertainty and unpredictability. This is a huge issue consistently being raised by many individuals. That the Trump administration keeps changing day after day and the rest. That is, of course, part of the White House style under President Trump. That is familiar to me. It also is part of the plan. It is part of the plan. The uncertainty is part of the plan because the president feels very strongly that an uncertain world is a world in which companies and businesses will make other choices about how they do business with the United States. They want businesses to decide to relocate to the United States and produce in the United States, or to find other export markets for their products, basically, because the U.S. is unreliable. So it's really critical to understand this, because this is going to continue, is my point, particularly under this administration. Second, China is still an enormous focus. It's a top focus, I think, it's fair to say. I believe China will end up with the highest average tariffs from the Trump administration. I think it will be around 60%, and that's roughly where it is today. I've been saying 60%. I think that's about right. It is about decoupling when it comes to major industries and sectors. And the administration also is going to squeeze other countries to decouple from China as well. So this is going to be a huge challenge for countries, particularly in East Asia, like Japan, that are, I think Japan is generally sympathetic with this, but is going to come under a lot of pressure to continue to kind of find a separate way from than with China. So that's where China is in this, the highest levels. Third, other countries. This is what I've been saying for months and months now. Yeah, there will be deals. There will be deals, but the whole point of this is a fundamental reset at a higher tariff level with the world. That includes Japan, that includes Korea, that includes the EU, that includes Mexico and Canada. This is the goal. So my guess is roughly in the 10 to 20% range on average is where the president feels is an appropriate level on average with most trading partners, basically. So I think that was coming, and I'm absolutely not surprised that is basically where we're at today. Fourth is just, the world is not the same, and we're going to continue to see a huge fragmentation in the world trading system and the idea of a single trading system that everyone's playing by the same rules. Why is that? Because the zero-sum world, it's not about reciprocity of terms, it's not about reciprocity of tariff rates, it's not about reciprocity of conditions. That's part of it, but it's really about reciprocity of results. It's about reciprocity of numbers and outcomes. So this is why the trade deficit takes on such a huge point, because you're either winning, you're ahead, or you're losing, you're behind. It's not seen as a full picture. It's seen as an individual transactional zero-sum relationship. Basically, it's zero-sum when it comes to results. So that is that. So as I say, we're going to see this course continue. This is the road ahead. Very much what Trump 2.0 is very much unfinished business from Trump 1.0. The roots are domestic in the United States, primarily. The world impacts it, absolutely. China impacts it, what's going on outside the world, but it's only going to be changed if the U.S. politics changes, and there's a political movement that decides that this polarization is not okay anymore, and return to consensus politics, where one group gets one thing and another group gets another thing, and everyone can claim victory. That's not what's going on right now. If one group does something, the other group wants to deny them that. Basically, that is the situation as it is today. People will try lawsuits, and I know this is people are pinning their hopes that lawsuits will somehow, excuse me, will somehow take the U.S. out of this picture and will kind of deny the president his freedom to set tariffs. I'm sort of pessimistic that when these appeals get to the Supreme Court, they'll be overturned. But even if the most recent decision is overturned by the Supreme Court and the president can no longer use that authority to set tariffs, the president has other choices, other tools in the toolbox to pull from to continue the tariff agenda. He can just switch to different other authorities. A perfect example is this. There's one authority which I won't mention, it's very, very detailed, but there's another authority which Japan knows very well, which is the Section 301 authority. This is what U.S. used to use to threaten Japan back in the 1980s and 1990s to correct certain trade practices. Trump administration can use that with China to start the first trade war. You can use it with Japan. You can use it with 70, 80, 90 countries, find some unfair trade practices, slap tariffs. The law is very clear. The president has a lot of authority to do this. So that is not going to be challenged successfully in the court. Only the U.S. Congress can take these authorities away. Only the U.S. Congress is in the position to cancel out all of those authorities that it gave different presidents over the years, starting with Franklin Roosevelt, and to pull it all back and say the Congress is going to be in control of tariffs again. It's in the Constitution, and you, Mr. President, are not going to be able to play with this any longer. But I think we can all understand, given the politics of today, that does not seem realistic, for now, at least. So, and then the other key point is the longer this goes on, the harder and harder it becomes to unwind these tariffs. Now, just in the last few weeks, we have the president of General Motors, GM, coming out and saying that she thinks that the tariffs are really good for GM, right? So you're going to see the U.S. corporate sector, different parts of the corporate sector have very different views about the tariffs. Some are going to want them, some are not going to want them. The longer this goes on, the harder and harder politically it becomes to unwind this picture. This was the whole point of setting up the international trading system, is to avoid this. Well, that's exactly the position that the U.S. is finding itself in today. What can Japan do? Well, besides continue to try and maintain and support the international trading system with other countries that value the rules, that value the system, and it's going to be an uphill climb to do that if the U.S. is trying to tear it apart over here. But that is, I think, one contribution, potentially, because the U.S. is at some point going to have to come back to something at some point. Second, obviously, is just to try and adjust and deal with the United States. And here, I know Japan has many objectives here. It is going to find, I think, any deal dissatisfactory because it's going to include tariffs at a tariff rate that Japan is probably not going to be comfortable with or okay with. But nonetheless, I do think Japan, of all countries, probably almost any country, has many more tools available to try and find a package or a deal of some kind that can help to tamp down on the extremes of some of these policies. So Minister Akazawa always, at the end of his press meetings for the press, always talks about three buckets of work with the United States. One is to expand trade. That's one bucket he always refers to. As a former negotiator, I understand what this means. What this means is that Japan will find a way to import more from the United States. That's what that means. Second, non-tariff measures. That's straightforward. Basically, Japan is going to address some of the concerns the U.S. has with barriers to trade in Japan. That's number two. Number three, he talks about economic security as the third bucket. That is investment. That is cooperation with the United States. That is dealing with China concerns. That is a whole mesh of other things. It's pipelines, it's shipbuilding, it's all that other stuff, basically. And Japan has those resources to offer some things, basically, on the table. So we'll see. Given that I think that Japan is going to have to accept some significant level of tariffs in any deal, we'll see if the Prime Minister of Japan makes the decision to try and close a deal before or after the upper house election. My guess maybe now is probably after. That's just my guess, my supposition, because it might not be received so well in Japan when it is announced, but I think that is the reality. So just very quickly, final words. Trade is difficult. Trade sometimes is zero-sum. So what I'm talking about here is not just a moment or an issue or a country or a problem. This is a systemic change. So in this direction, there are a number of legitimate U.S. trade and economic concerns that they're trying to address through this. But it's also true that the U.S. has given up on liberalization. I think that's true for the foreseeable future, both parties. Both parties have a weak or virtually no commitment to following the trade rules anymore, the trade rules the United States pushed onto the world. I do think that strong trade policy and trade enforcement is important, and I do think that it's fine to go off script when you're dealing with a country like China, for example. But my view, at least, is there are a lot of tools in the toolbox that don't require this dramatic change, this dramatic shift, that the U.S. can find a way forward without messing up the international trading system. But because of the zero-sum politics that I just described, that is the solution that both parties are using to try and fix these problems or address these problems. So, I do see that this is really going to continue so long as this polarization continues in the United States as it is. So that is not particularly optimistic tone, but it is a matter of politics in the U.S. And the thing that will fix it, if there is something to be fixed, is a shift in the politics in the United States. So let me stop there. Is that enough food fodder?
Yeah, thank you very much. First question from myself. So just assuming that Japan and the United States will strike a deal, how sticky will the deal be? How reliable, basically, is it?
Right. All of it will be reliable until there is a reason for it to, decision made that it should not be as reliable. So it's not terribly reliable, I guess is my point. This is the most difficult question I get is can Japan or other countries trust the deal, right? I really helped negotiate the one we did roughly 4 or 5 years ago now that was implemented. We're obviously not doing that, anymore. Expecting Japan to live up to the terms, but the U.S. is not living up to really those terms. This goes to the whole point of results being the measure of success as opposed to conditions or terms or agreements or obligations. So equanimity in conditions and rules is not going to be honored. In fact, former USTR Lighthizer early this year wrote an op-ed which made this exact point. Basically, he suggested that if there's going to be an international trading system, it should deal with the issue of trade balances. Trade balances change over time. This means that over time, you want the flexibility to raise tariffs even more, to wash out the trade imbalances, for example. So it is fungible, and I think it will continue to be fungible, particularly under the Trump administration.
Mm-hmm. Okay, if there are some questions from the floor, then please raise your hands, yeah?
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Kenji from Nikkei. I have many questions, but maybe I'll cut it down to maybe 2 or 3. One is on China. Would you please elaborate a bit more on how the Trump administration is going to deal with China going forward? Are there any sort of chances that some sort of a super big deal could be sort of met when China back down this much or when U.S. gets this much? Or is this something that is something completely impossible because given the positioning of China within the administration? That's my first question on China. Second one is on the current deal that was struck between Nippon Steel. That level of investment being made by the Japanese company to the United States steel industry. This is not about Masayoshi Son making a big investment in AI. This is in a very sort of backward, dilapidated industry. So wasn't that like from the start? should have been something that was completely acceptable. I was wondering why it took so long for them to sort of eventually come up. Because I think it's only a good deal for the United States to get more money out of a Japanese steel company with higher technology and money, able to help the U.S. industry, which is so backward now. So would you please give me your take on the deal with Nippon Steel? And sorry, if I give me the third one. I just learned that Trump just left the G7 side and in the middle of things. I mean, I know that he's saying that there's more important things to talk about, maybe about the Middle East at home and stuff, but he could have talked about it in Canada with 6 other leaders. What's in his mind, do you think? That, just doing things like this? I mean, just it's really maybe uncertainty, unpredictability, something that he wants to build in, as you said. But would you please comment on this as well, which is happening right now? Thank you very much.
Sure. Yeah, all hot questions. With China, I mean, the kind of deal that I think this is part of the transition we've seen that I wrote about, and it have been progressing over time, which is, any kind of deal you're going to see is not going to look like a traditional trade agreement. And you already see that, I think, when it comes to what was announced with the UK, for example. It's a package. It's like structuring a Wall Street deal, right? There's different pieces that come together that isn't just a traditional trade agreement, but is investment. It's cooperation. It's a mix, a mesh of things. So I think it's important to think about what's happening now in those terms as something different, a different kind of animal sort of agreement. It's almost like a relationship agreement in some fashion, in many ways. So is it possible or impossible? I mean, I think my best guess is kind of a grand deal is going to be extremely difficult to bring together, like they tried to do in the first administration, right? There was an actual written agreement on obligations and the rest. I don't think it will look like that. I think it will be much more of a series of measures and promises that may have some commitments, detailed commitments to them, but by and large will be more an issue of kind of watching and monitoring how they're implemented, and just a range of things. But I think it will be piecemeal and probably, as things evolve, basically over time. So we'll see. On Nippon Steel, why so long? I mean, when the deal was announced, I think, still in government for a month or two. But personally, knowing the politics of Washington and knowing the politics that were driving the elections that I mentioned, particularly of the Midwest and the votes there and the goal of securing union support and the voter support of union workers in those regions and the really outsized importance the steel industry plays in many respects. I was very pessimistic that this would ever even happen. I knew the opposition would be very high and very strong, and politically it was going to be virtually impossible in an election season for either side to agree to it just kind of on Nippon Steel's terms, I think. I am slightly surprised that they finally reached some kind of accommodation, but I always knew that if there was going to be one, it was going to be a minority stake or some kind of controlling interest was going to have to be accommodated in some fashion. And just to be frank, Japan does this too. You look at the case of Toshiba, and the government was very involved as well as the company in kind of blocking and preventing, U.S. investment in Toshiba, and there are many other companies that have had this situation. So these issues are important. There's legitimate concerns that are being dealt with, and the fact that they got to an accommodation actually, I think, is kind of a bit of a miracle. But the other reason Nippon Steel wanted to invest in the U.S., I suppose, is they were making a bet that tariffs were going to continue on steel. So so they were willing to, in my estimation, kind of pay a premium for having a foothold in the market, basically. So I think that is another facet to why they stayed in the game so long.
Before we go to the third question,
yes.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, of course.
From online?
Absolutely.
Rocky Swift from Reuters also asked about the Nippon Steel deal. So you mentioned already the golden share agreement. So he asked, is this also an appeasement to Trump? And his next lesson would be, what lesson can other negotiations take from this case?
I mean, I think appease, I wouldn't use those words. I think it is, it is a factor in the reality of the politics which is going to insist, regardless of party, that U.S. steel is not fully taken over by a foreign entity, even a country like Japan or an entity of a country like Japan. So, yeah. So, is it an indication of what's to come? I think, well, the irony, of course, is that you can also view this as a validation of the Trump administration's approach on this, because he's arguing that the only way to do business with the United States, predictable way to do business with the United States, is to invest in the United States, right? And so this is, sort of a manifestation of that, this desire to do this takeover is a manifestation that this is, in fact, that's where the incentives are, is to go in that direction. So, but the controlling stake is critical, and, as I say, this is a big deal in Japan as well when it comes to foreign M&A, trying to take over Japanese companies. So this is not unique to America, but certainly the steel industry. I mean, if the roles were reversed and if U.S. Steel was in a much stronger position and was going to take over Nippon Steel, imagine. There would be a huge challenge in Japan as well. People would be resistant to it. The government would, be silently or vocally opposed to it. So I do think it's just a legitimate set of issues when it comes to national security and the industrial base and the rest that both countries are kind of taking seriously. If anything, the U.S. is looking a little more like Japan than it used to look like when it comes to these M&A transactions. Leaving G7 in the middle, I think you answer the question, which is what is the president thinking and why is he doing this? I think no one is capable of or would dare answer that question, because I think only the president can speak for himself and what's in his mind. Is it a matter of uncertainty? Certainly it sends a message, right? It does send a message that United States is going to kind of set its own terms for how it interacts with the world, even in traditional groups like the G7 that it may not go as planned, basically. So I think that certainly is part of the messaging that's going on. But I'll just say this: when I was during the Biden administration, when the U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai went to the WTO ministerial meetings, they would try and get down to the wire. They were trying to negotiate something to save and support the WTO and the rest. She left a day early. Like, that was to my point about the level of commitment that the U.S. has to these international institutions is really, and certainly parts of the Biden administration were very focused on supporting international. So I don't want to get that wrong, but when it came to the WTO, it seemed like it wasn't such a big deal. So this is a fundamental shift and change when the United States doesn't necessarily see the value of these meetings, isn't really in there to support and get to the end of the game. The U.S. has a tendency to go home early.
Okay. I would like to come back to the Nippon Steel deal.
Sure.
There were other deals, like the Korean deal, buying Philly shipyard, for example, without any controlling share. With any golden share of the United States government. Japan is also, I think, part of the package. The Japanese package is also help in shipbuilding, ship maintenance, maybe here in Japan, but maybe also could imagine shipbuilding investments in the United States. Do we have to expect more government controlling shares, or is this a special case because of the high profile it took during the campaign?
I think it's, for now, probably a little more of a special case. I think if it's investments in energy, infrastructure, steel, some very fundamental basic industries, if it was maybe mining perhaps, something like that, I think you will see a tendency to lean more toward taking a second or third or fourth look at the transaction before deciding whether a full, 100% ownership or 51% ownership is appropriate for now. It could continue down this path as time goes on. I think we'll have to wait and see, but it certainly is a harbinger, I think, of more scrutiny, even of investments from allies, as it is of anything else.
Mm-hmm. Andy Sharp from Nikkei Asia asks about the G7 meeting and the lessons maybe for the direction of the Japan-US trade talks. So what are your thoughts about the direction of the Japan-US trade talks, he asked. He thinks that they won't come to a deal before the Trump deadline. He asked whether the trade deal or the trade talks have actually collapsed or not.
I see. So here, this is all a guess. So it's not really. I mean, can only be seen as a guess based on kind of my read of the room from the outside. I thought that there was a pretty probably better than 50-50 chance that roughly by this point there would be something could get put together. My sense is that, as I kind of mentioned previously, because there's an understanding that the Trump administration is not going to back off a lot of the tariffs that have already been imposed, that it become just going through that process of acceptance of that and trying to find every avenue to try and soften that basically has taken quite a long time. My sense is that now, probably, given the election that's coming up on July 20th, it may be seen from the Prime Minister's office as better to wait for the deal to come together until after the election in order, because it's not going to be one that's probably going to be received terribly well by the Japanese public, and that is the calculation that they're making. But this is just a guess based on what I see. I think they will get to something. I think they will get to something, but in some time, by the end of the summer.
Mm-hmm. Rice is a topic in Japan. Agriculture, you mentioned already, increased imports of US goods to Japan is maybe one of the parts of a deal that Japan might want to offer. What role does agriculture play for the United States in this area?
Well, it was really important when it came to the agreement that I worked on because, after the U.S. left after President Trump withdrew from TPP, I actually delivered the withdrawal letter to Japan. I think Japan tried to put the TPP band back together again, and it successfully did that, and it implemented the agreement. And then there was a concern on the U.S. agriculture sector of a loss of market share of agricultural products in Japan. It was a legitimate concern. Australia is going to have better access. Canada is going to have better access. New Zealand than the United States did. And so that whole negotiation ended up being all about really just restoring 90% of that access that Japan had provided in TPP and then gave back basically through that one limited trade agreement. So it is vital, and it's obviously an extremely important sector to the president and the coalition that he's built around the United States. So I do think that it has an important role. Rice, the short grain rice tends to come from California, which is not necessarily a major emphasis in this coalition. But other agricultural goods and finding outcomes to reduce some other barriers to trade, and potentially a few tariffs that remain. As I mentioned, we got 90% back. There's still more that could be gained. Will be an important part of those negotiations and seen as an important piece of any win that the president wants to announce with Japan. I think that agriculture will be there.
Mm-hmm. So Andy also asked, what kind of deal do you think Trump is actually seeking from Japan?
Okay. Again, it's kind of I think it's important to not, and this is where I just have a really difficult time with some of the commentary that's out there, because I think there's a trade world, and I'm in the trade world, and we all speak the same language, and we all talk the same thing, and no one kind of understands what we talk about, so that's fine. I understand that. But there's a real large part of the trade community that continues just to think of trade agreements in very traditional terms, as requiring a prologue and all these obligations and a dispute settlement mechanism and all these kind of tick all the box kind of things. That's just not what's happening. It's not what's going to happen. It's a different kind of deal. It's a relationship deal. That includes investment, it includes cooperation, it includes tariffs, it includes reducing barriers, and it's a package kind of thing, and it's a package that only the president, it seems, is going to be able to decide whether it's worth his time to make any concessions in his threats and in the high tariff numbers. Will he pull back on this or pull back on that in order to declare a victory? So I think that is where it's at, basically. So I think it's hard to predict what this is going to look like, but it's not going to be a traditional written trade agreement.
So then what are the best cards Japan has to play, especially to offer President Trump to convince him to lower some tariffs at least?
Well, I mean, obviously, I think Japan's objectives are going to be, or will need to be, I mean, given its own concerns and interests, to try and add to the U.S. side of the ledger. So it's investment in the U.S., it's more imports from the United States, so it's to support production in the United States. It's a range of other things. It can include making sure Japan's backdoor to China of U.S. Chinese goods made in China that come to Japan, maybe are lightly processed, or just someone just slaps a falsified label "made in Japan" on it, sends it to the U.S. to avoid the China tariffs. So it could be that kind of pledge to work to make sure that Japan doesn't become a backdoor to imports from China. It can be, industrial cooperation, which really means, usually investment of some kind, but it could be some technology work, shipbuilding, pipelines, energy, and spending the resources and investing in the U.S. as a home. Because if that is the package that I think that the president is going to be looking for, including other concessions from Japan to open its own market, in exchange for not taking away more from the Japan side of the ledger.
But he seems to be stuck in a way in the pre-first trade war thinking. His image seemed to be still basically beginning of the 80s to some extent of Japan. Japan has opened up quite considerably since then, though U.S. car manufacturers have basically withdrawn from Japan because of their own economic difficulties in the beginning of the 2000s. So what else can Japan offer to change his view of Japan? If Japan is already so much more open, how can Japan open more to convince Trump that Japan is an open country to the United States?
It's going to be actions, and it's going to be, I think Japan is going to not do well if it just continues to make the case, or tries to make the case, that Japan is open, and I'm sorry, Mr. President, but your car companies don't sell in Japan because they don't produce the cars that people want in Japan. That is not a winning argument with this team. They certainly feel that there's a legitimate issue of parts for produce cars in the U.S., produce manufactured goods in the U.S., produce semiconductors in the U.S. There's a lot of components that go into that, right? And there's a legitimate issue that, of course, that these parts that are necessary to import, they're all being hit with tariffs, and it's potentially reducing the competitiveness of the final goods, right, that are trying to be produced. So that is a huge legitimate issue, but I will assure you that the team feels, while they may understand that that is the case, they feel that all of this should be made in the United States, period. and that this is a necessary wringing out of, the last 30, 40 years of globalization in order to force this to happen, because they want it all made in the U.S., from the components to the middle to the final piece. Now, time will tell, and the harm and the pain that comes from this will tell as to if that will be a successful strategy. At the moment, support for tariffs for U.S. tariffs around the world is very underwater, of course, but support in the United States for the tariff agenda is also very underwater. It is the least popular of all the Trump policies that Americans are polled as to, or do you support which of the president's priorities do you support? And the tariff agenda is at the bottom of the list, and it's only about 35%, 38% of Americans support that. It is the Trump base that is that number, basically. So I think Americans intuitively understand that there's a huge cost coming to this, and they're very uncertain about how it's going to impact them personally. There are a lot of stories now about U.S. businesses that are hurting because they get these enormous tariff bills. They have no idea how to get the product. They're going to mortgage their house or go out of business. So this is all going to, churn over the next several months. And then we'll see if there's kind of a separate path to moderate this agenda, particularly for components and parts and basic materials before too long. We'll see.
More questions from the floor? Yeah, please.
Hello, Alan Smith.
I know Alan Smith. Hi, Alan Smith.
Not a journalist, a retired insurance executive and U.S. lawyer. President Trump sometimes seems to be surprised by the consequences of his policies, and you just touched on that a little bit with regard to components. But as an example, with regard to immigration, he's taken various positions, but seemed to be pursuing deporting anyone, regardless of other factors, who was undocumented. So he's going after people, without really looking at how much they had invested in the community or the community had invested in them. And there was a reaction. And now he's saying that despite the fact that before he wanted to deport everyone who was in the U.S. illegally, now he's listening to farmers and hoteliers, and he's going to change his policy. In the likely event that these tariffs result in inflation, which is very unpopular in the United States and has been the cause of political turmoil for incumbent presidents in many cases, although this president's not up for re-election, but there will be midterms. In the likely event that there is inflation and there's a negative reaction to that, do you think there's a possibility that President Trump will flip-flop and come back to some moderated position? Thank you.
Yeah. First of all, nice to see you. It's been a long time. Second, I mean, we already saw a little bit of this with the Liberation Day tariffs, and then 10 days later, or however many days later, there was a 90-day pause, right, because markets crashed. And, so, yes, there are guardrails. There are just fewer guardrails when it comes to the Republican Party than there were in the first administration, because the president really has firm control over the party, and many of the moderates in the party have retired or left the Congress. So he's in a much stronger hand when it comes to some of that resistance on Capitol Hill. The rest of it really comes from the economy, and it comes from popular opinion, and it comes from opposition expressed in other ways. So, we do see some moderation, and, this happened very quickly because of, it felt a little like the beginnings of the financial crisis there for about 24 hours. People were very uncertain, and I think those are the forces that are going to, so I think they already are at work. The forces are moderating. But we're talking different level of degree, right? We're some people talk about the president as having, kind of always, can be counted on to back off all the time. But the reality is that we're living in a world now of U.S. tariffs on the world that are the highest level they've been in 70, 80, 90 years, basically. So president hasn't fully backed off, if he's backed off at all, and it's very much part of the kind of the what I expected. There's going to be this reset at a higher level. Sees that as back 100 years ago, it was called a protective tariff, and Republicans and Democrats have their different views on that. I think that's what he wants to do. So it's really, it's moderation, but it's at a whole different level than where we were before. It's not going back to that, basically. So I do see that, yes.
Okay, then maybe one last question from myself. Japan seems to be especially dissatisfied with the 25% tariff on cars and car parts. Do you think that this part is negotiable at all? I mean, in the first Trump negotiation, basically Japan was able to negotiate that away. Do you think that Trump still remembers the negotiations and thinks, this time I won't, basically?
Yeah, I mean, definitely fewer exceptions is the rule, right? I think there's a sense that over a long period of time, as I mentioned, a lot of these things that were inside the box that came out were either softer than originally proposed or different than kind of the level or over time softened because the practical implications of implementing them meant that U.S. producers couldn't get product or couldn't access the product. So I do think there's a desire to stay the course, at least for now, as long as they possibly can. Autos and auto parts is very much in that. I mean, I do write in the book. It was July, August of 2017. So the president. First administration had only been in office for about 5-6 months. I had on my desk at USTR a memo that we were preparing to bring a Section 301 case against Japan on automobiles because the president's focus on automobile tariffs and the trade deficit in autos and auto parts was just extremely strong in the, even from the early part of the first administration. Had that gone forward, you would have had a very different U.S.-Japan Abe-Trump relationship that would have evolved over the following 4 years. That Japan would have been hit with the same kind of tariffs that the U.S. hit China with in 2017, 18, in that period of time. It didn't happen, and we ended up negotiating with Japan. So I know that these impulses, I know what the impulses are, I know what the concerns are. I don't think the president at this point, my guess is that there may be some moderation, some softening, maybe on parts in particular for a period of time until those parts can be made in the U.S. We'll see. These are all guesses. And maybe some, I can imagine a scenario where the president says, all right, so we will charge our standard 2.5% tariff for as many autos as the U.S. sells in Japan. You will get the 2.5% tariff for autos in the United States, and all the rest, which is 98% of Japanese imports, will be hit with 25%. I can see something like that coming out. That's just a guess, but that's the transactional way in which these issues are thought about. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight into the difficulty I think Japan is going to have in moving the president off of his commitment to that tariff in that sector.
Mm-hmm. Okay, time is up. Thank you very much.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you.
It was a pleasure to listen to you. And as it is common in our club, we hereby present you with a 1-year honorary membership.
Oh my goodness!
Whenever you come back to Tokyo, you can visit the club.
That's quite a surprise. Thank you.
I will show you
all the facilities
after this. Yeah.
That's very kind. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you very much.
So good to see you.
I'm working in Canada.
Yeah, of course. I know. It's been a long time. This is where you are now, in Okosan. Oh, great, yeah. How have you been?
Very fine.
A little busy?
Thank you very much.
A little busy?
Very busy.
I'm
Yeah.
sure that's right.
My potential question is, if any employee use Japanese,
Yeah.
how do you negotiate with them?
Oh, if I were your employee,
Yeah,
how would you
yeah,
do?
yeah.
I think Japan has many expert people who can answer that question for themselves.
Okay.
I'm not worried about Japanese negotiators. Right.
So what this trade policy?
Yeah, that's me. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. It's all different now. Yeah.
Nice meeting you.
Yeah, good to see you again. Really good to see you. Glad you're well. Thank you. Hi, Michael. Oh, yeah. Great. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's me. Right. Yes, I do.
And that could be quite harmful.
You're right.
Some other companies.
Yep.
What's the most, what do you think is the most sort of fearful part? I mean, is it where we're seeing right now, or are there specific areas in most of the Washington sort of
Well, from the first administration, when China retaliated against the tariffs, they chose the sectors carefully, and a lot on agriculture and shutting off agriculture exports. That's a big one for the base. So that's a big one. Yes, rare earths and the kind of strategic materials, the big one. Those are probably the two most significant ones, I think, politically and strategically, that they're going to, it gives them the strongest hand. Yeah, I mean, there's a relationship, and I think that, the degree to which the relationship will matter when it comes to the ebb and flow of what happens with China. I think that's true.
In that case, what about Trump and Shiba versus Trump and Biden?
I mean, I think he's generally shown that he has some affinity for Japan, respects Japan, understands, but wants to hold it. But Japan, for decades was winning, right? This whole zero-sum thing. So, I think that will.